We're in Nolan Park, our Governor's Island. That's where we are, at the Triangle Studios, and that's building 7B. And Ariel and Dawn, you both have been working out here since when? July?
Yeah, on and off since early July, I think.
Yeah. Same with you, Dawn.
Yeah, I feel like I intended to be here more. This year was not the best year for making plans and seeing plans come to fruition, but I have been out here through some hot months and a few cool rainy months, and it's beginning to cool down here as we come to the end of this year's residency. And when did you get out here, John?
I came out about mid-July. I think I was a little bit later than the both of you, actually. But then I was here virtually every day in August. I missed all of September, and now I've been here every day in October. So I was here in the summer and the fall. But the transition, I wasn't here. And this is a very strange year here on Governor's Island, and this is Triangle's second year here. And each of you are familiar with Triangle because you are alumni of Triangle. You worked at different, now let's see, Ariel, you were at a workshop.
Right, 2015, September, up in Salem, New York.
Yes. And Dawn?
In Dumbo, and I believe that was December 2015 or January through February 2016. Does that sound right? It must have been, end of 2015, beginning of 2016, yeah.
Yes. And both very different types of Triangle venues. But my question for both of you, I guess, right now would be, what on earth interested you in coming out here to Governor's Island, the Triangle project out here, which is, it's not an open call like Triangle Dumbo or Triangle Workshop. It's limited to just alumni. What was it about coming out here to Governor's Island that interested you? Why did you propose to do this?
I'm going to let Ariel answer first.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I've lived in New York my whole life, and I only really found out about Governor's Island, I think it was in 2016, in the summer. I had a friend who told me about this poetry festival, and there are all these art events that happen out here, but I hadn't known about them until I participated in this festival, and I was doing a collaboration involving an installation, performance, and poetic recording. And so because of that, I discovered that there were art residencies here. There were various interesting opportunities. And I visited one other time as well for another artist friend who was doing a residency here. So it was just in my mind. And then when I found out that Triangle was doing something here, I thought it would be great.
As a native New Yorker, how have you found working on Governor's Island? Just in terms of, first as an artist, but second as a New Yorker. What has this experience been like for you? How has it affected your being, your process?
Well, it's a very interesting place because it's part of New York, but it's also its own island. So just the process of coming here, it's like entering a different world. It makes you aware of the fact that Manhattan is an island, that the way that you see the buildings surrounding you as you come here. And then, yeah, it's like its own sort of separate reality. And there's something nice about that, having this much space and getting to be in a different world that's also part of New York.
Now, you have a little bit of your work here with you in the room, and one of the things that I've noticed as I've passed by your studio in the hallway here, I can peer in and I can see, first of all, the paint is just falling off the walls throughout this building, which is a typical thing in a Governor's Island Civil War era building. But I noticed that the paint chips actually seem to correspond pretty directly in some ways to your figures that you're doing. Is there been some kind of an interplay between the physical condition of these buildings and your work? And the question of antiquity seems to be in the air anytime I look into your room, into your studio.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating that this can happen to a house in just like a matter of decades. Because to me, it really does feel like an ancient fresco wall. But these figures are part of a project that I had started before I came here. So they've existed in different spaces. And now that they're here, they take on a different sort of character against these textures.
Yes. And these figures are coming from, what are the sources of your figures, would you say?
Everything. They started off as allegorical figures, so they're representing various concepts, abstract ideas, political, philosophical concepts. And then some of them come from things that I see on the street, or they come from all of history.
Well, one of the things, I have a question for you, because this is my second summer out here. I helped organize last summer and with a group. That was the first summer that Triangle was out here. And I was mostly just helping organize things last summer. But this summer, I've actually got a little spot that I've been working in. So I've been spending a lot more time out here. And one of the things, I'm going to ask you guys this, because I'm here alone quite often, just as I know you guys are, because it's we don't always overlap. And I might be here for quite a few hours by myself. And this building is a little strange, because I think I hear people walking around in it sometimes. Have you heard this?
Yeah, it's haunted.
I'm not crazy.
No. Well, maybe, but...
No, I think I hear people, and in a couple of cases, it's actually been true. There have been people that just walked in,
right.
But other times, no. So the building seems to have a very strange kind of life of its own, and that has certainly had an effect on my process in the building, or on the island even, because I think the island as well. So there's the interior of the building, but then the exterior, walking around, I'm getting, there are surprises every day in how I interact with the environment. And Don, I just want to ask you, I mean, it's interesting because I've been out here and we have to sign in as we come in, because we are respecting all of the health protocols due to COVID-19 here at Triangle and Governor's Island, and we have a sign-in book. And I'll often see, Don, you're signed in, but there's no Don. Don's not anywhere in the building. And then all of a sudden, I see you coming up with a big pile of rope or something that you're gleaning from the neighborhood. And I'd like to know a little bit about that. What is going on with that, Don?
Yeah, I'm really interested actually in this idea of ghosts. That was not my project necessarily, but I feel like in a way I came here looking for ghosts, and I'm a little disappointed that you two have encountered the supernatural, and I haven't. I was one of the early attractions for doing a project on Governor's Island was the ghost of the first garbage incinerator on North America, which opened here in the mid-19th century and was ultimately dismantled at the end of the 20th century. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of literature that's easily accessible about exactly where that was and what it looked like. I'm sure if I dug deeply enough in the New York Historical Society library, I could find exactly where it was and if there are any remnants of it. But my interest in Governor's Island came from an interest in solid waste management in New York City, and the mid-18th century method of managing the refuse of the city was in there were actually many incinerators around the city, and that was a technological period that kind of went out of favor in the mid 20th century. And as you both know, having lived in New York for some time, that we had a notorious landfill, Fresh Kills landfill. I work primarily based in projects, and site often influences those projects. So, as I'd mentioned, I had this attraction to Governor's Island, but I wasn't really able to get that project going by the time this residency came around. But I did have the idea of another project, which was originally proposed to Randall's Island in 2017. Maybe it was 2016. And it was creating an underwater garden using a type of seagrass. This particular seagrass does exist still in North America, in New England, but for the most part it went extinct at the beginning of the 20th century. But it was a seagrass that has an interesting material history here in New York and in New England, in the Mid-Atlantic area. It had functioned as a first insulation, acoustic insulation, actually in Rockefeller Center. They had used that as a sound installation. So essentially this seagrass would, underwater it creates an ecological environment. It's called an ecological engineer. So it actually improves the environment for itself to grow and improves the environment for other organisms. And some ways that it improves the water quality is by lowering the amount of dirt particulates in the water. It's called turbidity. It also creates a refuge for marine life. And in terms of its economic and material history, it used to seasonally wash on the shore, and people would collect it. And there was half a century or more of people collecting it and putting it to purpose. And originally it had been, perhaps most prominently, had been used as this insulation material. Now, what's interesting about this is that right at the time it was kind of being integrated as an insulation material, there was some kind of a plague, a bacterial infestation in North America. Most people believe it was related to the dumpage of different chemicals in the water bodies here around in the mid-Atlantic. So much of it went extinct, and actually there's only a few sanctuaries between Chesapeake Bay and Newfoundland that actually are cultivating it now, because people now understand the importance of this seagrass. So there's a little sanctuary out in Long Island that's led by Cornell University and Stony Brook, where they're trying to replant this grass. And I had proposed this, making a small underwater sanctuary off Randall's Island. But unfortunately, it was seen as there's a number of interesting issues with trying to do something in the water in New York, because most legal entities have jurisdictions around terrestrial bodies. That includes on Randall's Island. So they wouldn't actually let me go in the water there. And I thought perhaps on Governor's Island, I would have a little more luck. Ultimately, I was not able to do that project. But I had a really good time encountering the obstacles that the Governor's Island Trust proposed. They didn't downright say you can't do the project. They said you can't go in the water, you can't cross the fence. So I saw this as kind of a challenge, a constraint to work within. And I thought I started walking around and looking at how I could potentially plant this seagrass remotely or from a distance. And when I did that, I saw this rope, and I thought, wow, maybe what we need here between the artist and Governor's Island is a little bit rapport, a little bit more of a relationship. And so I thought, well, it looks like, some of it is unsightly refuse around the island, and some of it is actually kind of charming. I mean, when you see nautical rope, you kind of, it does evoke a sort of sense of, maritime life, fishing, transportation on boats. Unfortunately, it does have some deleterious environmental effects, which include, in the case of this sea rope, it's primarily nylon. So in terms of degrading, it doesn't really actually ever go anywhere. It breaks down into small particulates that ultimately find themselves into marine organisms that biomagnify into our own bodies once we consume the entity that ate a smaller entity that ate a smaller entity.
If I might jump in, is
Sure.
this the type of material that you're going to find in those big plastic islands in the Pacific?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. You'll definitely find particulates of this.
Right.
So a lot of the maritime activity, like fishing, is notorious for leaving refuse. But when people say like this massive island out in the Pacific, I don't think I don't think it's an island like you can walk on.
Right.
It's more of just a condition of, these materials have broken down to their smallest naturally eroding components, which in some ways are actually more dangerous than the larger material. It's more difficult to collect it. It's more difficult to determine if you're consuming it or not. And
Right.
It does get consumed by smaller organisms. So ultimately, I ended up collecting this rope as kind of a goodwill gesture to the trust. But then I kind of fell in love with the material, and the project has taken on a life of its own.
It's Don. It's so interesting for me to hear how each of you have responded to the situation here, and just in a broad brush sense, I'm thinking how Ariel, you've been very in tune with the interior. I think your work is about an interior world almost, and then you bring it into the exterior world. So the inside, or you kind of make the outside reflect what's on the inside. And Don, it seems like you're almost doing it a different way. You're going out into this exterior world around us on Governor's Island and gleaning. And you were saying you were missing that you were not getting connected to some kind of spirit world. You seem to have connected to the spirit world of the exterior and brought it in.
I'd agree with that, yeah.
And from my perspective, what's been very interesting is, as I mentioned, I would see your name written on our little log, and I'd see, where is this Don Daedalus? And I had it, because I think didn't meet you until the third or fourth time. And then I saw you kind of round the corner with a big thing of rope over your shoulder and tossing it up on the porch. And that's Don Daedalus. Oh, that's the guy. I knew right away, that's the guy. But you were bringing the spirit of the island, in a sense, inside. And then the next thing I see is a big pile of rope sitting in the middle of the room, coiled up. And it was really powerful, very powerful, because, like you, I've noticed this stuff laying around, and you have different thoughts or feelings, or you just plain ignore it, because riding over on the Governor's Island ferry every day, I see a coil of that rope sitting there, and it's utilitarian. It has a kind of beauty. As an artist, I'm looking and I'm saying, that's a beautiful thing. But you're tapping into another, and I guess I think this is what's interesting about this relationship of a group of artists working in this building. And I guess back to what I was just saying, you're bringing the spirit of the exterior into the interior, and you're bringing this interior world and making it an external expression of it. And well, I guess I'm just saying I find that really very interesting. It's synoptic, in other words. You know what I mean by that? It means it's like multiple views. This is a very charged historical place, I think. It's fair to say. Governor's Island. There's so many things, and then we're not even mentioning. I'm listening to you talk about these marine biology questions, and of course, there's the whole history of the oyster here. Which, hearing you talk about the seagrasses, I'm thinking, how far of a stretch is it to, if they can start to raise oysters on the island here, to replenish the harbor and to, bring back the environmental health to the harbor. It's not that far a stretch to see the seagrasses, But these are questions in your work, Don, that have to do with the environment, our physical environment. And but there gets to be this kind of almost spiritual element to it as well, from my perspective, which is where I'm seeing your work coming from, is the spirit of the interior. And then there's the whole underlying fact that this really is a Native American homeland right here where we're sitting. And the acknowledgement of that is another question, And anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this line of thought, but except for the fact that what I do see is a process of restoration, or a kind of process of maybe even reconcilement. Taking what is refuse, garbage, and, as you mentioned, something dangerous to our world, and reclaiming it. And I see something very similar with your work, taking things, because when I see your your iconography, so to speak. It's like it's a re-examining of what the figure is and what the figure actually represents in visual art. But you've been doing something very interesting on this ferry ride back and forth, and I know it's been part of your work for a long time, but you've taken full advantage of that ferry by taking your figures and sticking them into the windows on the boat and taking these wonderful photographs. So that it's like a traveling art show that you have.
Yeah, and it's a way of using the city as a sort of canvas itself. So what I've started doing is I'll be riding the train, and I'll put my figures into the windows and take videos or pictures of them, so that whatever station we're passing or whatever is happening in the background becomes part of it. And so in that way, they're not just part of this house, but they're part of every part of the journey.
So your work is not static. Your work is...
No, it wants to travel.
It's very much of a performance in a sense, but it kind of... I wouldn't want to use that words really, because I think it's more than that. I think there's a kind of a ritual to what you're doing. Just looking in your studio again, there seems to be, it's always animated. And there does seem to be a kind of, I guess I would probably describe it as some kind of there's a ritual going on, or some kind of interaction between your figures that's beyond just a formal placement of things. There seems to be a constant kind of conversation going on between all these figures and yourself. You seem to be one of the characters.
Yeah.
Not just the artist, you're one of the characters.
Yeah, or all of the characters. I started, I've been making figures like this for a long time, although they've evolved into different forms. But in the beginning, I was using myself as the model to create the figures, and I would make myself costumes or hats or masks, and then set up a mirror and draw from that. And now I'm also collecting images from like all of art history, photos of different periods of history, photos of myself and friends doing performances. But that's what it all comes from.
Yeah. And another question that comes up for me, for both of you, really, is, and it gets back to this whole question I was asking earlier, why on earth would you want to come out to Governor's Island? And by the way, we're wearing these masks, and there's a reason for it. I think everybody probably knows what that is, but there's a pandemic going on, and here we are on Governor's Island, and there are no, the art world, so to speak, is basically, how would you describe it? It's kind of in shutdown in many ways. So a lot of expectations that people, I guess let me put it like this. I think many people have expectations of doing an art residency, doing an art show, or even just, what's the point of going and making art in a time like this? Why? Why would you do that? What is it that you expect from making your art in a time like this? What do you expect it to reward yourself? Do you expect rewards for yourself? Do you expect it to contribute in some way? What is the reasoning? What purpose is there in making and doing your work in a situation where there's very likely little of the typical reward, you know, it's not as if we're going to have like some big retrospective and, you know, and get lots of praise for it. So what does, what brings you to the studio each day? Clearly, you're both kind of obsessed with doing what you're doing, and yet, what are the rewards for it? What's in it for you? What do you see this about? What is this about for you in that respect?
Yeah, I could take a prod at that, but I also want to just dog ear that I do have a question for Ariel on this topic, but I want to wait for her to have a chance to hear. Perhaps she answers my question before I ask it. That's a great question, John. I think part of the question is like, how is meaning in the time of a pandemic? What is the purpose of art, or what motivates you to do something? And I think that's actually maybe more of a profound question than we may understand it to be. Particularly if you think about this video document as being watched after the pandemic. One thing that I think gives me pause is it is quite difficult to be motivated to do anything right now. And particularly if it's something that is contingent upon sharing with other people, or receiving something that someone else is sharing with you right now. And that's one strange phenomenon. The idea that, you know, you're going to do something, you're going to share it with somebody, and you know that they're going to be sort of checked out, unmotivated, uninspired right now, because there is this kind of, I would say, collective ennui that we have right now. That's one strange phenomenon that's going on. Obviously, the primary phenomenon that's unfortunate is this lethal pathogen that's being shared. But another strange phenomenon that may not be obvious for, you know, future individuals thinking about this residency or this video document is how time has been so different right now. Everything seems quite distant, temporally distant, almost to the point that you don't need to address it. Like something a week away feels like it's almost next year. But at the same time, time passes very quickly. So in the case of this residency, it does feel like I've only been out here maybe 4 or 5 times. I think I've been out here maybe a dozen times. But it does feel like it was very, very short residency. Now, to just give your question the attention that it deserves by answering it directly, I felt demotivated to come out here, but there was a sense that if I just did something, which could have just been walking around, something could emerge from it. And I think that was the right intuition. And in a lot of ways, during this pandemic, I have been creatively surviving by tricking myself into doing creative things. That might mean taking a camera outside without the intention of making a video or a film, a proper artifice. But then once it kind of gets underway, feeling the sense of obligation to complete it and address it has been a way of, this has been kind of a mode to trick myself into doing the creative things that I know that actually do contribute to my mental health well-being. And, you know, I I don't know if you two know me enough to know that I am actually quite a bit of a workaholic. Most of the time I'm toiling, 7 days a week, most hours, and never short of inspiration. So it is a strange period right now. I feel like ultimately this time at Governor's Island will really be pivotal, actually, particularly how the constraints of my initial intentions have led to a new project here.
If I might jump in on that, because as I'm hearing you reflect on your process here, first of all, I kind of recognize you were a workaholic right off the bat when I first met you, because it was obvious you were out scouting everywhere, and when you were here, just like turning every stone over, and that's what a workaholic, I think, does. And there's, I guess it's a term, I suppose, which could have negative connotations, but it can certainly, properly channeled, produces something else. And you were sharing with me some of your ideas and some of the things that were happening, and the word that came up was resiliency. Not to put, kind of release the cat out of the bag, but this is something that really impressed me when you started telling me, what you were learning out here, what you were doing. And this seemed to just kind of pop up out of that pile of rope, literally, resiliency, which to me is about continually showing up, as they say, as opposed to not showing up or just shutting down. That was a really poignant moment for me, because I know how difficult it is to show up on Governor's Island. It's literally, as Ariel this morning, you had such a crazy time getting here, which in and of itself is an interesting story. I hope you'll write that down someday. Absolutely. Because it would be a wonderful little short story in itself.
Yes.
Manhattan native can't figure out how to get to the destination.
Yeah.
Incredible, but that's New York. But it's also Governor's Island, and I think, to me, one of the real hallmarks of art making is showing up. And something I always like to talk about is the one definition of art, if you look in the dictionary, that I can always relate to, as opposed to the 3 other pages of definitions, like sculpture, cooking, painting, drawing, whatever. Right on top, it usually says to be, art, like thou art, has nothing to do with what we think of as art on a wall or being an artist. It's just to be art, which to me is the biggest part of, first of all, being an artist, but in terms of specifically working here at Governor's Island, just showing up takes 90% of your creativity on a daily basis. And once you're here, once you've shown up, it flows. That's the reward, is I got here. And even if you wind up just taking a nap on the floor, it's rewarding. But, that's why I felt that what you discovered was, to me, it was a really poignant moment, just in hearing you describe that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. that word resiliency. What happened? Where did that come from?
It's a great question. I think that's actually, where did resiliency come from? Maybe a question for so many individuals who pause to realize how frequently it's being used right now. It's the ubiquity of it now. And I feel like that prior to the pandemic, it was being used almost on a municipal level or a municipal scale, particularly in the context of climate change and the environment. But I believe that now it has kind of come down out of the clouds, and it's now really more than ever on a personal level, on a personal scale. It's the personality trait that everybody who survives this pandemic will have developed. They will have honed their own form of resiliency, of how to persist, how to carry on. Now, in the context of this rope and the project that found me, I didn't really find it. I just picked up the rope and I hung it up on the stairs for several months, and I should thank you both for putting up with the smell of this rope. That's one of the few things that doesn't convey on video very well. But this rope...
the tide is out.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So when the tide is out around the shore, this rope that has accumulated all this algae and not the cleanest water in the world, informing the smell and the odor of this rope, once it got in here, once it got into the confines of this building, it's kind of a salty, like plant bacteria. It's kind of like, feels a little bit unclean, but I guess in some way we were all wearing masks most of the time, which probably helped. But eventually the rope dried out, and I was just looking at that material thinking, what is it that I could do with this stuff? I mean, there's so many potentials. You could make forms with it, whatever. And then I just thought, the thing that makes the most sense is just using it as like cursive, as text. And particularly again with this site of Governor's Island, I had been reading this press release that Nova had forwarded to us about the announcement of the Climate Change Center. And it's framed as a general press release to the public, as well as these snippets, these quotes of the different governmental and agency individuals who are talking about why they support the Climate Change Center. And I saw it over and over again, this word resiliency. And again, I think when many people use it, we are using it as this environmental catchphrase. But in this context, with the pandemic, the economy, political, democratic questions, civil society questions, interpersonal questions, even just personal levels of mental health, of how you keep going, that word just seems prescient right now. And so this is my current proposal to several cultural sites around the city to use this rope to form the word resiliency. And John, you gave me the wonderful idea of decolonizing the term and putting it in other languages, which is another thing that I don't know about me, but I am an aspiring polyglot. I'm very bad at learning languages, but I love to do it, and it's a practice that I have to study a language. Now I should say I don't speak it. I'll study it, which it may be a perversion of the form of the activity. But I have been studying Spanish for the better part of 15 years. And interestingly, the term resiliency was almost never used prior to the last 3 to 5 years. It translated more closely to resistencia, which sounds more like resistance. But it's almost an adaptation more recently that there is some use of the word resiliencia, which is it's almost a recognition of this new usage of the word resiliency. That I would say in English, resiliency primarily was applied to a material quality, the resiliency of maybe elastic or the resiliency of a durable textile prior to the last 5 years or so. Now there are other languages that I've been also studying and searching the terminology and usage of resiliency. Vietnamese is another that I've been looking at. And the question though becomes, when you put an artwork in the public, you're speaking to a public, and being a native New Yorker, you know that New York is a city of many villages and many publics. So the issue now is, the joy is really like finding the location, the language, and the community, and bringing these three together. And this is what I'll be toiling in over the next months. Now, before we get too far down the line, though, I did want to come back to this question for Ariel about the pandemic and your work. And Ariel, I noticed your figures that you have in your studio here. They're side by side with material about wearing masks or the pandemic.
Oh, yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, something that I started doing was making signs that incorporated the figures, but also added text. And I think that connects a lot to what you were saying about language and the evolving meaning of different words, because each of my figures represents a word. So I do have like a goddess of resilience or fortitude, really, but similar concepts. Forces like liberty and revolution and resistance and all sorts of things. So like this one is sort of a freedom of speech goddess with a spray paint can.
I love that.
So the signs actually started out of protests, and now I'm also making more informative signs or pandemic signs, or I made a sign downstairs to try to keep people out of the house.
I think it's been more effective actually than the padlock that we had on the door.
I think it's really the Sphinx.
The sign was very effective. It's really it's been very useful.
Really, it's John's additional signs that also incorporate a barrier, I think, which really puts the point across.
It's a gate.
Yeah, it's a gate.
And you need the password.
It's a series of. So something about making these figures also have a practical purpose, I think, like manifests in making signs, that they become less abstract that way, and it becomes like more about making a statement.
Would you agree that many of your figures have kind of a classical Greek aesthetic? Can you talk about that and how that interacts with some of the very modern themes that you're discussing, in that, like the spray paint individual?
Although even this shape is actually an Amazonian archery pose. So that is what she started as.
Ariel, would you mind if I spread them
Oh
out
yeah,
a
go
little
ahead.
bit
I wish that I had actually like sort of a marionette structure with strings. I feel like that would be a better way to display them.
And you also brought this magic palette.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I did bring my magic palette as well.
The magic palette.
Yes. So my background academically is in ancient Greek mythology, archaeology, literature, and so on. So the way that I see the world has always been through the filter of mythology. And in the ancient world especially, everything is a god. Like any concept that you can think of has a god associated with it. So the entire world is made out of these gods, spirits, and so on. And of course, those carry on into the present because we continue to grapple with the same forces that we always have. It's just the human condition. So what I love is the way that these ancient forces continue to be part of our collective consciousness. Even walking around the city, you'll see the name of a store, and it's something that connects all the way back thousands of years. So I'm constantly collecting those, writing down phrases that have to do with these ideas.
Yeah, and I in this city, it's quite overt that many individuals, institutions as well, make deliberate connections, right? So you've got the columns of, they call them neoclassical columns, right? Of different buildings, the Metropolitan, when you want to convey the idea that austerity, timelessness, and the embrace of the Hellenistic values, you put columns and stairs, and then some kind of a frieze above with various virtues.
Yeah, exactly. And like the seal of New York with justice and liberty, all the buildings downtown with these virtuous sculptures that are supposed to show that we are governing ourselves appropriately, whether or not we are.
Excelsior, New
Yes.
York, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
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 Interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of language, and because I was, as I was listening to you talk about your attachment to that, or your exploration of resiliency, one of the things that had occurred to me in your studio and in your work is that the characters in this, I think this dovetails with what you're getting into in your question to Ariel, is there's this conversation going on. Every time I look in, they're placed in a different way, and it's a very animated conversation going on. So to me, I started wondering if there was a particular language that was happening. And, so this has been something, again, that I've been pondering out here, is the question of language, which again is why I was so knocked out when you came up with your thing, because I was already thinking, is Ariel inventing some kind of language here, or is there a language that's being spoken between these characters? And then there was not just the language, but it was also a language with a particular purpose behind it, because it was like a saga. I'm coming from Scandinavian background, so we have these sagas. So language was the tool that was used to explain the journey. So the language had a very important purpose. It wasn't just to, say how do I feel. It was telling a story, and not just a story, but describing the journey,
Yes.
which is what I was wondering. I was thinking, is Ariel inventing some language here to describe a particular journey or saga or story?
Yeah. Wow, there's so many different things to say, but in terms of language, yeah, I think the reason, and one of the reasons that I create is to tell stories, basically. And like whether they're personal stories or like mythic, epic stories on a different level. But these are sort of, each one could be a letter or a word, or I look a lot at ancient Egyptian art where like this could be the glyph for something. So it could be a letter, it could have a sound, but then it could also be a concept at the same time. So I do think of it as a language. And like Don, I also love to study language. I'm not at all good at speaking languages, but I'm best at ancient languages actually. But I'm fascinated by the different words for different ideas and the way that they're influenced by the culture that they come from, and how they vary and how they're similar.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated with this development that seems to be happening in our little building here and our surroundings. Just as kind of observing from my spot, I've been reading and studying actually tents, temporary structures, and I've built one in my studio that you guys have seen. And I really I was just gleaning like you, Don. I was going out, and after the storms around here, the trees drop these sticks, all over the place, and the grounds people here are amazing. They get that stuff up pretty quickly, but I try to grab some choice ones, and I've used those as a structure to build, they're like my tent poles. So I built these, I built a little tent in there to be my studio within a studio, and this is part of the process I've been doing for some time. But I've been studying and reading about tents for quite a while, just how are they built, and studying Bedouin tents and Native American tents and tents from yurts, which are not exactly tents, but those type of temporary structures that nomadic peoples use. But I've become very, very tuned in with the Laplanders tents, and the Laps traditionally are in the northern Scandinavian countries and into Russia. And myself being of Norwegian descent on my father's side, I always had an interest in the Laps. And I found as I was studying their structures that I related to it in a way that I couldn't to Middle Eastern tent makers or Native American, North American tent makers. I didn't relate in quite the same way. There was something about the way the Laplanders built their tents, which are not that dissimilar from those other groups, but there was just some kind of way in which they built things which seemed my own particular temperament, maybe my genes even, seemed to respond to it. So I've sort of been using that as a model. But I started reading. I amazingly discovered there was a book written in like 1908 or something by a Laplander, a guy who was a reindeer herder, and he wrote a book about the Laps and all of the different things they did in reindeer herding and building tents. And I kind of stumbled on it because I wanted to read about the tents. But he describes everything in this book about being a Lap. And one of the big problems is wolves. They had to protect themselves from wolves, their herds, their reindeer herds. So they had lots of things. And so there's like this one chapter just about hunting wolves and how to keep the wolves at bay.
Wow.
But I bring this up because, to my surprise, one of the most important things that he described, his name is Johan Turi, is the name of this Laplander who wrote this book. And I'm going down this path for a reason. The most important tool was language, because and this was it. There was a little incantation that they would use to keep the wolf at bay. And they called them, and the people who watched the herds of reindeer, they were called watchers. They just went out and watched the herd, and they had to watch for the wolves. And he would describe a good watcher would say this incantation when they'd see a wolf. And if he said it right, the wolf would not be able to attack the herd. But the incantation had to be made in 3 languages.
Wow. And
if you could say the first language and the second language, but you failed in the third, the wolf was going to get your reindeer and possibly you. But the reason you had, and I thought, 3 languages, and so the languages that it had to be spoken in, and the Laplanders did have their own language, but they had to be spoken in Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish. And it was, I've only read this quite recently, in fact, and so I'm still trying to get my mind around this, what this actually signifies. But it was so important that this incantation be said in 3 languages for it to work. And if it didn't, you couldn't say it in 3 languages, not only did it not work, but you may well pay the price, the ultimate price. So that's why I've come to this point where I'm feeling like there's a new language that is really necessary in these times. And I'm very interested because you just see the incredible abuse of language in our culture right now. And just not, I mean, the political landscape is just one element of this, but everywhere else. And the fact that, especially here in the US, in the United States, where people largely barely speak one language, how can we communicate if we're not multilingual? At least in our understanding. And to me, it seems like you guys are onto something that is really prescient.
Yeah, there's so much in that, John. One thing that when you're talking about the importance of language, one thing that I've noticed during this pandemic situation is how difficult it is to read people's facial expressions, given that they have a mask on, right? So it is really a time that is necessitating innovation, creativity, improvisation. But so much of what you said about the tents and this kind of supernatural incantation is really riveting. I feel that I would be lost not to pick up and tie some of the topics that you've brought up together, and specifically where you had earlier acknowledged that we are here in land that is now colonized by indigenous people, and I feel prior to this conversation, one theme that has been very pertinent to me has been specifically New York, but North American society, our collision with a past, specifically with solid waste, with garbage, with our excrement. And one parallel that I've found fascinating and inspiring has been the landfill mounds. I mentioned Fresh Kills before. Fresh Kills landfill on another island here in New York, in Staten Island, was, at the time of its closure, the largest landfill in the world. It was the largest man-made object in the world, actually larger than the Great Wall of China. Now there's
That's incredible.
yeah, massive. It was, and the funny thing is that we don't really think of that as something that's man-made because it's not intentional, right? Garbage is almost by definition, I would say a wandering definition, an evolving definition, our unintentional byproducts. But there were also people here in this New York region who also produced mounds prior to settlers coming here. And in North America, most people are familiar with the Ohio mound builders. And it's lesser known that actually, as far as upstate New York, some indigenous people did produce mounds. Now, these may actually be people who lived here prior to the individuals, the tribes that we encountered or that American colonists encountered. But these mounds, in some ways, were erased when land was converted to an agrarian land. But some of them still persist. And if you type in Indian mound on Google Maps, you will be surprised to find the number of places, either towns, cemeteries that are called Indian mounds, that are built on top of or inadvertently preserving this prehistoric tradition that indigenous people had. Now, there are other areas in the Midwest that you can more easily uncover these mounds, but our consumerist society did produce these mounds. And another thing that I think is fascinating, a parallel that you made me so clearly see, John, when you're discussing these tents and the idea of nomadic people, nomadic societies, and you may even get to the scale of nomadic civilization, is that this moment of the pandemic has highlighted a movement toward a mobile nomadic society. I mean, we had somewhere around 500,000 residents of New York who went to either their second home or another place, lived with families. But with the increasingly digital world, there is a class of people who are actually becoming nomadic. And I think it should give pause to think that in some way, the colonizers are recreating the world and lifestyle of the people that they displaced. Either in their solid waste artifacts or in understanding the benefits, the joys, often obstacles of being mobile, of being able to move, rather than this, you create a structure, you exist in the structure, you die in that structure. That may have been actually, it may turn out to be that will be a minority experience in human life on this planet. It may be that the dominant experience, certainly in the past, but perhaps even in the future, that we are increasingly mobile, that we just move around. And I think this pandemic has really highlighted certainly a benefit for some people, right, who felt that it was dangerous to stay here, but then also the impact of that, the restrictions of movement, at least in terms of between boundaries and countries in the international context.
Yes, I spent a fair amount of time in the Midwest where there are some mounds in East St. Louis called the Cahokia Mounds, which actually are the largest ones in the U.S. And they are big. They're quite big. There's a Walmart built right into the side of one, and a number of them that were there have been leveled, but there's still some there. And then I had a chance to go to Jackson, Tennessee one time, to a small university to do a talk well, actually I was there at a workshop. I was the artist in residence, and they'd take their art students and they'd do this outdoor project. And it was at a site where there were a whole bunch of earthworks, and there was one mound and that was left, and it was about 90 feet tall. And it was just this big mound with a lot of trees growing on it now. But the mound structure is really the earliest form of architecture. I mean, pyramids are mound structures. But previous to that, of course, you had, and especially in the Middle East, when mounds were built, because it's, you get up on top of the mound, you're going to see a long way further, and you're going to see where your potential enemies might be, or where more fertile ground might be, or where water might be. So the idea of the mound, I think, is pretty. I think it's an obvious. What am I looking for? It's a kind of thing that's very human, and here in North America, and right here, one of the ways that archaeologists are going to discover how, people used to live is they go look for the pile of oysters, which is a mound, And these mounds were considered to be sacred, in these various cultures in some form or another. And it's incredible to me that we, in American society, since the industrial age, we've created these landfills or mounds, but we don't consider them sacred. We consider them an eyesore, something we don't want to acknowledge, when in fact, when you think about what is housed inside of the landfills of America, it's probably one of the most it's a great museum of art, really, when you think about what's in there. It's like it's holding more of what we would, I guess the documents of culture. Are we?
That one's where you could keep talking.
Okay. As a document of our society is best represented by what's inside these landfills, as opposed to going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so I think we're at a place where, certainly, Don, you're doing it. You're acknowledging what is inside those landfills, in a sense, And I think, and I love your insight about the temporary nature of society. This pandemic, I live in Queens, in Jackson Heights, which is one of the culinary capitals of perhaps the world. It's amazing. And we have this incredible cafe society emerging out there, because all these great little restaurants, they can't have people inside now. So they've built these wonderful things out of wooden pallets and canvas. And they're essentially street tents, and they're decorated, and every single one of these, I really wish I was a better photographer, and I wish I could just do a whole project documenting these wonderful structures that all these restaurateurs have come up with, because they're beautiful architectural structures, but they're tents, They're temporary structures, and they even move, because they move them around just with the weather and with the but also just as you mentioned, there's clear evidence that the type of economy that we now have and that has been developing in the last 20, 30 years, there are more and more people that are they're living in their Winnebagos, or they're learning how to be essentially nomads. And as artists, I mean, especially, in the United States, or the Americas, North America in particular, artists were always itinerant. And I think historically, artists have always been somewhat itinerant. We are nomads in a sense. That's kind of the thing I've always related to. And the tent concept in my work has been there for a long time. When I started studying these Bedouin tents and so on, the idea that we are sojourners, we're temporary, we're passing through. And but anyway, I'm musing on some things here. And I don't know how to conclude this conversation because I feel like somehow we're supposed to conclude it.
Yeah.
But it
The
seems
thing
like
is, there are just so many more openings.
Yeah.
I feel like every time something is said, there are like numerous directions it could go, and so then it's like a spider web. But we've only like traveled on one,
It's just amazing to talk with the two of you, and it's been wonderful to be out here. We still have a few more weeks, and it's been wonderful to be out here and just see how you guys have really, kind of developed a new language in your work. Don, I hadn't seen your work before, but Ariel, I know your work, and I from previous times, but I see new things developing, and we're at a point in time where there's so much talk about the end of culture, the end of history. There's a lot of that type of discussion. We're in the end times, that sort of thing, and I think what I'm seeing is something different that has to do with what happens when people apply creative energy to express their individual visions, and which I think is what I'm witnessing with the two of you. And what I see is not the end of something, I see the beginning of something. I see a reinvention, perhaps not even a reinvention, just a brand new invention. And so I think what I'm seeing is a new language developing right here. And the idea that the landfill is as significant an entity as an art museum, that's quite an acknowledgement. And that's what we've been discussing here. The idea that has a level of significance that has been really not paid attention to in our post-industrial or industrial and post-industrial age. And I think what you are bringing to the table is a very different view on our relationship to the environment and to our history as humanity, as our history as human beings. So I see a new language developing in what you guys are doing. And I don't know, that's my takeaway from our discussion today, and I feel like this is a conversation that's only beginning. I feel like we're just getting warmed up to these thoughts, to these questions, and I think in the art world, so to speak, or the thing that we call the art world, I think people are very, very chained to the concept of the canon all the time. I think our whole Western culture is really, deeply committed to the notion of the canon, or some linear historical progression, and perhaps that is what has ended. So what happens next? Is everything over, or is everything starting? And I see something new starting with what you guys are doing here in your work. So, I don't know. That's just my takeaway today. And I don't know where you go from there, but...
Good talking with you, John. Good talking with you, Ariel.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.